In the quiet, leafy suburbs of Fairfax, Virginia, the Wallace household appeared perfect to anyone who happened to drive by. Carol Wallace, a 42-year-old housewife, had the kind of life most women dreamed of: a successful lawyer husband, James Wallace, and a well-maintained home on a peaceful street. But behind the neat, manicured lawns and friendly neighbors, Carol's life was anything but perfect. James Wallace was rarely home. His long hours at the law firm meant that he was more often in the city than at their suburban haven. He had a towering reputation in his field, and work was always his priority. Over time, Carol became accustomed to the emptiness of their grand house, filling her days with trivial chores and neighborhood events. There was an emptiness in her marriage that neither she nor James spoke of. Carol wanted more. She just didn't know what until it arrived in the form of David, her 19-year-old stepson. David was James's son from his previous marriage, a marriage that had ended on civil terms years ago. Having spent most of his childhood with his mother in Arlington, David had always felt somewhat distant from his father. He was now back for the summer after his freshman year at George Mason University, where he was studying architecture. Tall, charming, and with the kind of easy smile that turned heads, David was full of the energy and spirit that Carol found herself drawn to almost immediately. At first, it was innocent. Carol saw herself as a mother figure, stepping in to help guide David where his own parents had drifted apart. Their initial conversations were casual. She'd ask about his classes, his friends, his plans for the future. And David, in turn, appreciated her attention, her eagerness to listen. Yet, as weeks passed, something began to shift. Carol's feelings toward David turned into something more than maternal affection. It happened gradually: longer glances across the dinner table, a lingering touch on the arm, and the growing excitement she felt whenever David came home from a late night out with friends. Carol had never thought of herself as someone who would entertain an affair, let alone with her stepson. But here she was, intoxicated by his youth and charm. She convinced herself it was harmless, a crush that would fade with time, but the more she told herself it was nothing, the stronger the pull became. One evening in late June, when the summer heat made the air thick and heavy, the two of them found themselves alone in the kitchen. James was out of town for a case in New York, and the house felt oddly intimate without him. As they finished up dinner, David poured them both a glass of wine. It was the first time they had ever shared one-on-one time, and the atmosphere shifted, unspoken tension filling the room. Carol's heart raced as she looked at David over the rim of her glass. "You seem different lately," David said, breaking the silence. His tone was casual, but the words carried weight. "Like something's on your mind." Carol laughed nervously, brushing off his observation. "I think it's just this heat. It's making everything feel heavy." David raised an eyebrow, not quite believing her but letting it slide. "Yeah, maybe. I've been feeling it too." The night dragged on, and the more wine they consumed, the more comfortable they became. As they sat on the back porch, the dim light from the kitchen casting soft shadows around them, Carol could feel the electricity between them. Every glance felt charged, every touch accidental but deliberate. As the clock ticked past midnight, David sighed and stretched, his shirt riding up just enough to reveal a sliver of skin. Carol's eyes followed the movement, her pulse quickening. She knew this was dangerous, but in that moment, it didn't matter. It wasn't long before David noticed her lingering gaze, and for the first time something passed between them that was undeniable. "Carol," he started, his voice hesitant. She cut him off, her voice soft but steady. "Don't. Let's not pretend there isn't something happening here." David's expression faltered, a mixture of confusion and understanding. He didn't move, but the air between them crackled with tension. Carol felt a rush of adrenaline, the kind she hadn't felt in years, as she reached over and placed her hand on his. His skin was warm, and the contact sent a jolt through her. "We can't," David whispered, though his words lacked conviction. "But we already are," Carol responded, her voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, the line was crossed. The weeks that followed were a blur of secrecy and stolen moments. Every time James left for work, Carol and David found themselves in each other's arms, caught in the throes of an affair that neither of them knew how to stop. The excitement, the danger, it was everything Carol had been missing in her life. She had never felt so alive, so desired. But with each passing day, her obsession with David grew. What had started as a passionate affair turned into a consuming need. David, on the other hand, was conflicted. At first, the allure of being with someone older, someone forbidden, was intoxicating. But soon, the reality of their situation began to weigh on him. This wasn't just a fling. It was his stepmother, his father's wife. The guilt gnawed at him, especially as he saw his father obliviously go about his daily life, trusting Carol completely. David knew it had to end, but every time he tried to pull away, Carol drew him back in. One evening in mid-August, after James had left for another business trip, Carol and David found themselves alone again. This time, however, something felt different. The usual excitement wasn't there for David, and he could see the desperation in Carol's eyes growing stronger. After they shared a strained dinner, David stood by the window, staring out into the night, deep in thought. "We can't keep doing this," he finally said, breaking the silence. Carol, who had been watching him intently, felt a pang of fear rise in her chest. "What do you mean?" David turned to face her, his expression pained. Us. It's wrong. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't anymore. We have to stop." Carol's heart raced and panic set in. "David, don't say that. We're good together. You know we are." "No," he said firmly, his voice breaking. "We're not. This isn't real, Carol. It's a mistake." She stepped closer to him, her hands trembling. "You don't mean that. You're just scared. You love me. I know you do." David shook his head, backing away from her. "It doesn't matter. This has to end." Carol's fear turned into anger. "If you leave me, I'll tell your father. I'll ruin everything for you." David froze, shock and disbelief washing over his face. "You wouldn't." "Try me," she hissed, her voice filled with desperation. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the tension thick and suffocating. Then, without another word, David turned and walked out of the room, leaving Carol standing alone, her heart pounding in her chest. But the story doesn't end there. Carol's obsession had only just begun, and she wasn't about to let David go without a fight. Carol's mind raced as David distanced himself over the following days, withdrawing into his room and spending less time at home. The more he pulled away, the more desperate she became. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, not after everything they had shared. Her obsession consumed her, and the fear of rejection twisted into something darker. One evening, with James out of town yet again, Carol finally confronted David. The tension between them had been building all day, and she couldn't take it anymore. She found him in the living room, packing his things, ready to leave early for school. "David, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "There's nothing left to say," he replied, not looking up. "I'm leaving tomorrow." "You can't leave me." Carol's voice rose, panic bubbling to the surface. She rushed toward him, grabbing his arm. "You promised you wouldn't go. We're meant to be together." David pulled his arm free, his expression cold and resolute. "This was a mistake, Carol. I should have never let it happen." Her heart pounded in her chest. "No! You love me. I know you do." "It's over," David said sharply, shoving a few more clothes into his bag. "I'm done." The finality of his words cut through her like a blade. As David turned his back on her, something inside Carol snapped. Rage, fear, and desperation clouded her mind. Without thinking, she stormed into the kitchen, her hands trembling as they gripped the handle of the largest kitchen knife. Her vision blurred with tears, but all she could see was David walking out of her life forever. Before she even realized what she was doing, she was back in the living room, the knife clutched tightly in her hand. "You can't leave me," she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. David turned, his eyes widening as he saw the blade. "Carol, put that down," he said, stepping back, his hands raised defensively. But Carol was beyond reasoning. She lunged at him, her body driven by blind emotion. The knife plunged into David's chest with a sickening thud. His gasp echoed through the room as he stumbled back, blood soaking through his shirt. For a brief moment, everything stopped. Carol stood frozen, the knife still in her hand, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. David collapsed to the floor, his face contorted in pain, his eyes filled with shock and confusion. He looked up at her, his lips trembling as he struggled to speak. "Why?" he gasped, his voice barely audible. The reality of what she had done hit Carol like a tidal wave. She dropped the knife, her hands shaking violently as she knelt beside him. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice trembling with regret. David's body convulsed as the blood pooled around him. His breaths grew ragged, his eyes glazing over as the life drained from his body. Carol pressed her hands to the wound, trying in vain to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. Within minutes, he was gone. The room fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Carol sat there, her hands stained with blood, staring down at David's lifeless body. Her mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The man she had loved, the man she had become obsessed with, was dead, and she had killed him. Her breathing quickened as the weight of her actions pressed down on her. What had she done? What was she going to do now? Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the room. The blood was everywhere, smeared across the floor and her clothes. She had to clean it up. She had to hide the evidence before anyone found out. But the sound of footsteps approaching the house made her heart stop. James. He must have returned early. Carol stood frozen as the front door opened, and James stepped inside, calling out her name. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. When he finally entered the living room, he stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening in horror at the sight before him. "Carol, what happened?" he stammered, his voice filled with shock. She stood there, blood on her hands, her mind blank. He was going to leave me," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I couldn't let him go." James stared at her in disbelief, his face pale. He took a step back, shaking his head. "You killed him." "I didn't mean to." Carol's voice cracked, her eyes welling up with tears. "I couldn't let him go." Without another word, James rushed out of the room, pulling his phone from his pocket. She knew he was calling the police. Panic gripped her, but there was nothing she could do. The knife was still on the floor, the blood everywhere. There was no hiding what she had done. The sirens blared in the distance, growing louder as they approached the house. Carol's hands trembled as she backed away from David's body, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. Everything was over. Minutes later, the police stormed into the house, their flashlights sweeping the room. They found Carol standing in the corner, covered in blood, her eyes wide with shock. She didn't resist as they handcuffed her, leading her out of the house. As they drove away, the flashing lights illuminating the dark street, Carol looked back at the house where her life had unraveled, where her obsession had turned deadly. She felt numb, her mind a haze of regret and disbelief. In the days that followed, the story of the brutal murder of David Wallace spread through the community like wildfire. Headlines splashed across newspapers. Housewife's affair with stepson ends in murder. The once idyllic Wallace household became a symbol of scandal and tragedy, a tale whispered about for years to come. Carol sat in her jail cell, haunted by the image of David's lifeless body, his blood on her hands. The love that had consumed her, the obsession that had driven her to madness, had led to nothing but death and destruction.